În vremuri tulburi în care totul e nesigur, trebuie să decidem în ce direcție vrem să o luăm. Fondul Monetar Internațional a venit în România să ne dea sfaturi, dar și să vadă în ce stare e economia noastră. Am avut ocazia să discut cu șeful misiunii FMI la București. Iată ce am aflat. First of all, thank you for your time and for this opportunity. You are at the end, as we know, of an almost 2-week-long visit to Romania, during which you had time to talk and consult with the major financial institutions of Romania. If you were to give a diagnosis, which would be the most painful part of Romanian economy?
When we look at the Romanian economy, I should, before starting to the areas that are more weak, I would first mention that we were positively surprised by the strong growth in the first quarter of the year. We see that many people increased their spending, their consumption, probably after the pandemic period, and that supported the economy in the beginning of the year. Now looking forward, we expect that the economy will be slowing down, even though for the year as a whole, for 2022 as a whole, we still project growth between 3.5% and 4.5%, which is high compared with many European countries. But after the first quarter, that does involve some slowdown because of a number of forces that are in place throughout Europe. We see high inflation, which is reducing people's ability to spend. We see a lot of uncertainty, which makes people more hesitant to spend money. We see financial markets that are becoming tighter. And we see throughout Europe that economies are slowing down, which also means that exports from Romania will be slowing down. So we expect the future will still be good, but not as good as the first quarter. And that is going to affect many people, and it's going to affect the budget. And talking about the budget, you mentioned where do you see some weaknesses? Well, the budget is one of them. Romania has a large fiscal deficit, not a new problem, but a serious problem. And addressing that has been a big part of our discussions.
And how would you address that? Or how should the government address that?
So the government is committed to addressing that. Let me start with that. The government has agreed on a path for reducing the deficit over time from year to year, and they are committed to reducing it to 5.8% of GDP in 2022, and we very much welcome that. Now, to make that happen, not just in 2022, but over a number of years, will require some difficult steps. The first one is to improve the collection of taxes. So make sure that people pay the taxes that they are expected to pay.
The government is trying to do that for a long time. What should change?
There are reforms in place, and many of those reforms don't result in higher collection quickly. But for example, more digitalization is an important part of the answer, so that the government has more information. So they know who is not paying or what sectors are paying less, where should they focus on when they do their audits. So that is one part of the answer, improving tax collection. Only one part, because improving tax collection alone, we don't think is enough to reduce the deficit from close to 6% to less than 3%. So more will be needed, and part of our recommendations is also to make some reforms to the tax system. In that context, the main point we are making is that the tax system in Romania is rather complex because it has many exemptions, special treatments for certain groups, loopholes so that people can avoid paying taxes. And as a result of those complexities, there is not really a flat tax right now because there are too many holes in the system for it to be called a flat tax.
Would you also adjust the taxation level?
So we think that by fixing those holes in the system, those complexities, you can generate a lot more revenue without increasing tax rates. And that is really the primary proposal we would have for the authorities, to focus on making the tax system more clean, more simple, and thereby making sure that everybody pays their fair share of the tax revenues that are needed.
When you're talking about a fair share of taxes, do you also refer to a progressive labor tax system?
That is an option, that is a possibility. So first of all, a fair system would require that everybody pays and does not use loopholes and exemptions. But if you have that, then you can choose if you want to have a real flat tax or a real progressive tax. That is a choice to be made. We mentioned some arguments why a progressive tax might be helpful. For example, it can generate even more revenue, and it can put the burden on those people who can afford it the most. Keeping in mind that Romania is a country with a relatively unequal distribution of income to begin with. So those are some arguments why you might want to choose a progressive system. But as we said, that is not our first recommendation. It is a choice to be made once you have a clean tax base to begin with.
Given what you know so far about Romania, and you've come to know a lot, of course, about Romanian economy, and given the level of income that Romanians have, imagine, just for a minute, that you were a citizen of my country, and you weren't rich, you weren't even middle class. How would you protect your family's budget, and what would you ask your government to do?
The second part of your question is the area where I have some answers I would like to give, because the recommendations that we have been offering the authorities in our conclusions, we believe would help Romania and Romanians. They address some of the weaknesses of the economy that over time also reduce the growth of the economy and therefore people's ability to find jobs and find good, well-paying jobs. When we talk about public finances, about the government budget, that is not because the budget is so interesting by itself, it is because it matters for the economy. If there is a weak budget situation, companies will be hesitant to invest in Romania, which then reduces the jobs that are available. And it reduces the government's ability to help people who are really in need because they don't have the money left available to address those problems. So the recommendations we have, even though they may seem rather high level, are really intended to help people. Other recommendations we have as well, when we talk about implementing the funding from the European Union for improving infrastructure. Improving infrastructure helps people. It helps people directly because they need the infrastructure, and it helps them also because it will attract more companies and companies that can afford to pay higher wages to Romania. So infrastructure is part of helping Romanians, improving state-owned enterprises, improving the digitalization of the economy. All reforms that we recommend that at the end are there for those Romanians that you're talking about.
In your report, you mentioned the VAT. Where would you see a reasonable level of VAT if it weren't so unequal on different sectors?
I think VAT is another example where our recommendations are not about increasing tax rates. Our recommendations are about collecting better, first of all. There is a gap between the VAT that is expected to be paid and what is actually collected. So that is our first priority. Now, on top of that, when you look at the goods that are in the different categories of VAT, because you have higher and lower rates, we could imagine that some of the items that are at the lower rates might not be goods that are consumed much by people with lower levels of income.
We have a lower rate on VAT for food.
So food is an example where a lower VAT rate is very common across Europe. But there may be other goods in there that you could reconsider and look at if maybe those could be into a higher bracket. But we are not talking about, for example, changing the normal VAT bracket. That is not part of what we are proposing. It's really about streamlining and collecting better.
So maybe raising the VAT where it is lower to the general level.
If these are goods that are not consumed by especially lower income groups, or if these are goods where you feel that these should not be encouraged, for example, if they're not particularly healthy or good for the environment, then I can imagine that you would look if you can move them between the brackets. We do not have specific recommendations. I cannot tell you this good should be moved from this bracket to that bracket.
Given your whole image regarding taxation in Romania, and the fact that the government is talking about introducing a solidarity tax, which means 1% of annual business figure of every company over 300 million euros, or 0.5% for every company in Romania, no matter the size. How would you see that?
We have not seen an official proposal for that, and so we also have not made that part of our recommendations. So I don't have a specific advice on this matter. When it comes to taxation, I think the proposals that we would recommend, first of all, are the ones that I mentioned about cleaning up the existing tax system, making it more simple and more logical.
Do you think Romania is in a crisis? Because many experts or analysts or markets are talking about a crisis. Or the world. Mm-hmm. Is the world in a crisis? And if it is, what kind of crisis?
The world is in an unusual and difficult situation. We see a number of shocks worldwide, one after the other. The pandemic, food prices, fuel prices, feeding into inflation. It's a very unusual situation, much more uncertain than usual. And these are all shocks that are common across countries. The shocks that we're talking about for Romania are the same as we're talking about in other countries, even if the specific circumstances may be a bit different. So we are not projecting a recession for Romania. We are projecting a slowdown. We do see these headwinds, and we think it is important for the government to be as prepared as possible to deal with those.
Given the macro fiscal picture of Romania that you talked about, the deficit, for example, but also we have a very large public debt, which comes with its own consequences. Romania is very much dependent on loans and on very expensive loans compared to other countries in the region. What is your view on this situation?
High fiscal deficits need to be financed, and that means that debt is going up, is still going up over time. Now, the level of debt of Romania is not higher than in many other countries because it started from a relatively low level, but it keeps going up. So you cannot continue on that path. That's why this fiscal adjustment that we were talking about is important. So it's not at this point a debt problem, it is really a problem of increases in debt that over time would become unsustainable. And you're right, the financing is becoming more expensive. Not just for Romania, but we see central banks across the world increasing interest rates. and that feeds through into the cost of borrowing for the government. So yes, lending has become more expensive. We see it in Romania, we see it in other countries, and it is one more reason to be very careful in your fiscal plans, in reducing the deficit as planned, implementing those reforms, both because that reduces the deficit directly, but also because it improves the image of Romania and the Romanian government in the financial markets. So it also helps in finding better financing terms for the loans that you still have to make.
You mentioned responsible government. Would you say the Romanian government is acting responsibly when more than 90% of its revenue is given for salaries, social assistance, and mostly just making the government and the state work?
In our discussions with the government, we have seen a clear commitment to reducing the deficit and to increasing investment, building on the facilities that are made available by the European Union, which create a lot of room for additional investment and a lot of expectations regarding reform. So we very much encourage the government to do what it is planning to do, which is to make the best possible use of these opportunities and to put the public finances on a much more healthy basis.
Talking about that, Romania's inflation is growing, and it's growing fast. We've just received news this morning that inflation is 14.5%. It's on one of the poorest populations in Europe, which is very hard to live with. There is a public expectation for state aid, which has come historically throughout the time, but also the budget is very strained. The government has no more money to stretch. So where would the solution be?
Mm-hmm. There's several parts to this. The first part is inflation is indeed high. So a priority is to reduce inflation. That's where, first of all, the central bank comes in. It is tightening monetary policy, which will help reduce inflation over time. That does not happen quickly, and the central bank cannot change the sources of the high inflation, the international increase in food and fuel prices, but it can affect how it feeds through into Romania. So the tightening by the central bank in Romania, as central banks across the world are doing, should help, we expect it will help, reduce inflation over time, gradually. So that is the first part of the answer. Now, while inflation is still high, many groups are impacted by it. People who are on fixed income, pensioners, for example, they are hit immediately. Also, people who depend especially on the goods that are increasing the most, the food and fuel prices, the energy prices, they are hit. So then the government has some options, has some room to help. The room may be limited, but there is some room, and it is being used. For example, the government put in place caps on the prices on electricity and gas, which was a effective and relatively simple way of protecting many people against those increases. Now, it's also a relatively expensive way because it protects almost everybody. So our advice would be to make that protection more targeted over time, so you gradually increase those prices of electricity and gas before the system comes to an end in the middle of 2023. And at the same time, you focus your protection on those people who need it the most. So targeting protection at people who need it the most is the way you can try to reconcile the need to protect people with the limited financial space that the government has.
So that would mean reducing the capping or eliminating the capping earlier than the spring of 2023?
It would mean that the capped price could increase gradually while you put in place more protection, more support for people who need it the most.
Earlier than spring 2023.
Yes, but so we're not talking about ending it now, or we're talking about gradually changing the system, moving from a short-term protection system to a more sustainable, longer-term protection system. Also because if you gradually increase those prices, that's helpful for motivating people to conserve more energy, which is important because of climate change. So there's more in play than only the social policy. There's also the climate aspect to it. It's important for all of us to try to save more energy and protect the climate.
Which would ideally be something we would all want on the long term. On the short term, still, it seems rather cynical, some would think, to increase prices on energy to save energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So across the world, prices have increased. That has happened, and we expect prices will stay high. So the question is, how do you and when do you pass that through to the people in the economy? In the short term, you can afford to cap it and to limit those increases, but that is not a sustainable long-term solution, and that would not be a solution that in the long term would help avoid or limit climate change. So that's why we suggest moving from the short-term solution to a better long-term solution.
You talked about pensions. Romania has a system which we here call special pensions, and that's for a different category of people that receive this kind of income. I'm sure you know about it. Mm-hmm. What is your view on this? As you talked about making it more, let's say, leveled, the system of pensions.
Right. The pension system in Romania is relatively complex, as several systems are. And the authorities have committed to pension reform. It's part of the commitments in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan to the European Union. So pension reform is coming, and what we hope is that this pension reform will take a look at the entire pension system, make the entire pension system more sustainable and more predictable. So that would include all components of the pensions.
You mentioned in your report the exchange rate, about being more flexible. What would that mean when I go to the exchange office? What would that mean to me?
Let me first step back and talk a bit about the exchange rate. The exchange rate has been kept stable, pretty stable, for some time, especially in crisis times. That can be a very useful measure. Right now, without this stability, prices might have increased even more. You might have had even more inflation. And maybe also more uncertainty about what the exchange rate would do, which in a time of crisis might not help. So this stability in difficult times, we understand. But what we recommend in our conclusions is that over the medium term, it would help to make the exchange rate more flexible and allow the exchange rate to move with shocks to the economy, because an exchange rate that is flexible can also help protect against shocks. It can support exports, for example, when exports are hit by a slowdown. So we think that more flexibility in the longer run would be helpful for Romania. But the timing of that has to depend on how you look at those near-term risks and inflation effects. So we don't try to fine-tune and spell out exactly when you would want to move to a more flexible system.
Countries around Romania have already started announcing hard dates for adhering to the Eurozone. Bulgaria, Serbia recently, they're the recent example. Still, Romania still doesn't seem to meet the necessary criteria for changing the currency. What is your opinion on these never met plans and promises of entering the Eurozone?
Right. Entering or becoming part of the Eurozone is a process, is not a step. It's not a matter of suddenly you meet the criteria and then you're part of it. So there is a choice if that is the path you want to be on at this point, and then it would be a longer process. Our recommendations are more about what should be done over the next few years rather than what should be done over the longer term, which could involve steps towards more unification. So that goes beyond the period that we are looking at in our recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.